Joseph Stalin was one of history's most brutal dictators, but there's a side of Stalin that few people understand. While the world watched Hitler's ambitions in the West, Stalin was building something equally vast, something hidden, systematic, and deliberate. A shadow economy, a network of plundered wealth, billions in gold, stolen art, and war booty that disappeared into Soviet vaults. This is the story of how Stalin got rich, how he monetized conquest, and where billions in Soviet wealth went a mystery that still haunts historians today. Welcome to Stalin's secret empire. But unlike other dictators who were satisfied with mere authority, Stalin understood something deeper. Real power required real wealth. When Stalin consolidated control over the Soviet Union in the late 1922, he faced an immediate problem. The nation was poor. The economy was devastated by civil war. The peasantry was rebellious. The Soviet industrial base was primitive, compared to the West. If Stalin wanted to build a superpower that could rival Britain, Germany, and eventually America, he needed resources. Massive resources. And so Stalin made a fateful decision. He would extract wealth from his own people. Through forced collectivization, Stalin seized grain from peasant farmers. Millions starved. Between 5 and 7 million people died in the famine of 1932 to 1933. But Stalin didn't see peasants. He saw grain. He saw a resource that could be exported, converted into currency, and used to import Western machinery for his factories. It was brutal economic logic. Humans were expendable. Resources were valuable. By the late 1930s, Stalin had built a system where the state owned everything, and he personally controlled the state. Every factory, every farm, every piece of property belonged to Stalin in the most literal sense. When you own everything, you can accumulate wealth at a scale that private individuals can only dream of. But the real test came when Germany invaded in 1941. The Soviet Union was unprepared. German forces advanced rapidly across Soviet territory, occupying vast regions. Stalin's initial response was near panic. Soviet generals were purged. The economy was in chaos. It seemed possible that Germany might defeat the Soviet Union entirely. But Stalin survived. Through sheer determination and through mobilizing Soviet resources on an unprecedented scale, Stalin kept the war effort going. By 1943, the momentum shifted. Soviet forces began pushing the Germans back, and as Soviet armies advanced westward, liberating territory from German occupation, something remarkable happened. Soviet soldiers began to plunder everything they could find. This wasn't spontaneous looting by individual soldiers. This was systematic, organized theft directed from the highest levels of the Soviet government. Stalin called these operations trophy brigades. The trophy brigades were special military units tasked with one specific mission: extract wealth from conquered territories and bring it back to the Soviet Union. As Soviet forces occupied Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Germany, and other territories, trophy brigades followed behind. They would systematically search for valuables: artwork, sculptures, manuscripts, books, scientific equipment, industrial machinery, religious artifacts. If it was portable and valuable, they took it. The scale was almost incomprehensible. Historians estimate that Soviet trophy brigades plundered 2.5 million individual items: paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, artifacts from territories they conquered. Many of these items were masterpieces. Some were priceless. All of them were stolen. A painting by Rembrandt, stolen from a German museum, ended up in Soviet hands. A sculpture from a Polish church, confiscated and transported to Moscow. Entire libraries, thousands of rare books and manuscripts loaded onto trains and sent eastward. But it wasn't just art. Trophy brigades also seized industrial equipment, scientific instruments, entire factory components. Anything that had value and could be moved was taken. And where did all this wealth go? Officially, it belonged to the Soviet state. In practice, it belonged to Stalin. Because in Stalin's Soviet Union, There was no meaningful distinction between the state and Stalin himself. Stalin didn't have a salary officially. He was just a party official earning a modest stipend. But he had access to everything. Every piece of plundered art could be viewed in his private collections. Every valuable artifact could be displayed in his private palaces. Every gram of gold could be held in vaults under his personal protection. Stalin had transformed the entire Soviet state into his personal wealth extraction machine. The Soviet trophy system was extraordinary in its sophistication and scope. Unlike Nazi Germany, where plunder was largely disorganized individual officers stealing valuables, corrupt officials embezzling resources, the Soviet plunder was centralized and methodical. Stalin created an entire bureaucratic apparatus dedicated to extracting and cataloging stolen goods. Special departments were established. The main administration for trophies and reparations was created specifically to organize the confiscation, transportation, and storage of plundered materials. Art historians were conscripted into military service to identify valuable artwork. Curators were assigned to trophy brigades to evaluate artistic value. Transportation networks were organized to move massive quantities of stolen goods. It was, in essence, a state-run theft operation. One contemporary account describes Soviet soldiers methodically photographing artwork, cataloguing items by category: paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, etc., and then carefully packing them for transport to the Soviet Union. The operation employed thousands of people and required dozens of trains. The plundered materials were distributed according to Stalin's preferences. The most valuable artwork went to Stalin's personal collections. Second-tier items went to Soviet state museums. Lesser items went to Soviet military leaders and party officials as rewards for loyalty. But Stalin's system went beyond just art and artifacts. Trophy brigades also confiscated gold, currency, jewels, and precious metals. As Soviet armies advanced through Hungary and Germany, they discovered vast quantities of gold, both gold confiscated by the Nazis from Jews and other victims, and gold stored by German banks and institutions. Soviet forces systematically looted German gold reserves, moving them to the Soviet Union by rail and ship. The scale was staggering. Historical estimates suggest that Soviet trophy operations extracted tens of billions of dollars worth of materials, in modern currency, from conquered territories. And here's what makes this remarkable. Almost none of this wealth was ever returned or accounted for. After the war, when discussion began about reparations and the return of cultural property, the Soviet Union maintained that any items they had confiscated were rightfully Soviet property compensation for Soviet suffering and Soviet losses during the war. This claim was legally questionable but politically powerful. The Soviet Union had suffered terribly. Tens of millions of Soviet citizens had died. Entire regions had been devastated. From Stalin's perspective, taking German and Eastern European valuables was nothing compared to the cost the Soviet Union had paid. So the plundered materials stayed in the Soviet Union. Paintings looted from German museums were displayed in Soviet galleries. Gold confiscated from conquered territories was melted down and held in Soviet vaults. Manuscripts stolen from Polish libraries were catalogued and shelved in Soviet archives. And Stalin personally controlled the disposition of the most valuable items. In Stalin's final years, he accumulated an extraordinary personal collection of stolen artwork. His dacha, country villa, and the Kremlin were filled with paintings and sculptures taken from across Europe. He would spend evenings admiring his stolen masterpieces, secure in the knowledge that he and only he possessed them. But how much wealth was Stalin actually controlling? This is where the numbers become almost abstract. The Soviet Union's total confiscated wealth from World War II and its aftermath was probably worth, in modern currency, hundreds of billions of dollars. This includes gold, currency, artwork, industrial equipment, scientific instruments, and other valuables. Not all of this was under Stalin's direct control. Much went to the Soviet state, Soviet military institutions, and Soviet industries. But a significant portion, probably tens of billions of dollars worth, was under Stalin's personal influence. For context, this wealth rivaled or exceeded the entire GDP of many nations. It made Stalin, on paper, one of the richest men in history, though his wealth was measured in state resources rather than personal bank accounts. But Stalin's accumulation of wealth created a problem. Where did it all go? Beneath the Kremlin, deep underground, Stalin had a secret. Historical accounts and Soviet defector testimonies suggest that Stalin maintained vast underground storage facilities, bunkers, vaults, and hidden chambers where his most valuable possessions were kept. These weren't just safes. They were elaborate underground complexes. One account describes a bunker complex beneath the Kremlin, with rooms designed specifically to store artwork, temperature-controlled vaults for preserving paintings, secure chambers for holding gold and currency, libraries for storing rare manuscripts and books. The facilities were guarded by Stalin's secret police, the NKVD and later the KGB. Stalin would visit these vaults personally, examining his collections, checking inventories, ensuring that his wealth remained secure. It became almost an obsession, the need to know exactly what he possessed and where it was kept. But here's where the mystery deepens. Most of these vaults have never been fully documented or inventoried. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there was chaos. Records were destroyed or hidden. Many officials fled, and remarkably, some of the underground vaults beneath the Kremlin were never fully catalogued or accessed by the post-Soviet government. This has led to extraordinary theories and questions. How much gold did Stalin actually possess? Some estimates suggest tens of thousands of tons, but exact figures have never been confirmed. What happened to all the artwork and artifacts? Many items that were definitely looted have never been located. Were there gold transfers or hidden accounts that Stalin established? Some historians believe Stalin moved assets to secure locations outside the Soviet Union. What documents or records did Stalin keep about his personal wealth? Many records were destroyed or remain classified. The lack of clarity has spawned decades of investigation and speculation. Art historians have spent careers trying to track down paintings that were looted by Soviet trophy brigades. Economists have tried to reconstruct Soviet wealth figures based on fragmentary evidence. Intelligence agencies have attempted to locate hidden Soviet gold caches. But the fundamental problem remains. Stalin's wealth was deliberately obscured. He wanted to hide the true extent of his personal fortune. He created systems of secrecy and compartmentalization so that no single person, besides himself, knew the full scope of what he possessed. This secrecy was deliberate, because in an officially communist state that claimed to be free from class distinctions, having a dictator who accumulated incomprehensible personal wealth would be ideologically problematic. So Stalin hid it, behind layers of bureaucracy, official secrecy, and compartmentalized knowledge. When World War II ended in 1945, Stalin faced a new challenge: how to secure his wealth for the post-war era. The Soviet Union was economically devastated. Cities were destroyed. Agriculture had been decimated. Millions were homeless and starving. For the Soviet state to rebuild, it needed resources. But for Stalin personally, the post-war period represented an opportunity to consolidate and transfer his wealth in ways that would ensure its security and his continued control. What follows is based on historical accounts and declassified information, though much remains unclear. Stalin appears to have initiated systematic transfers of Soviet wealth to secure locations both within the Soviet Union and potentially abroad. Within the Soviet Union, Stalin continued to accumulate and organize his personal collections. The artwork confiscated during the war was distributed among Soviet museums, but the finest pieces remained in Stalin's personal collections, or in specially designated state repositories that were effectively controlled by Stalin. Gold, meanwhile, was moved to multiple locations for security. The Soviet gold reserve, which had been depleted during the early Soviet period, was replenished by the gold confiscated during World War II and the post-war period. But instead of centralizing this gold, Stalin had it distributed among multiple vaults in different locations: Moscow, Leningrad, other cities, and reportedly even some locations outside major population centers. This distributed storage system served multiple purposes. It made the gold harder to locate or seize in case of war or invasion. It also gave Stalin leverage if gold was stored in multiple locations. Multiple officials would need to cooperate to access it, which made rebellion or defection more difficult. But the question remains, did Stalin move any wealth outside the Soviet Union? This is where the historical record becomes murky. Some accounts from Soviet defectors, CIA investigators, and independent historians suggest that Stalin may have established hidden accounts or transferred wealth to secure locations outside the USSR. Possible destinations allegedly included Switzerland, Sweden, and possibly other countries. The accounts were supposedly created under false names, making them difficult to trace. However, the evidence for these external transfers is fragmentary and disputed. Some historians argue that such transfers would have been unnecessary, given Stalin's complete control within the Soviet Union. Others argue that Stalin, having learned from Hitler's fate, wanted insurance wealth hidden outside the Soviet Union in case his regime fell. What we do know is this: the total amount of Soviet wealth that was accumulated, plundered, and subsequently moved or hidden was enormous and remains substantially unaccounted for. After Stalin's death in 1953, and especially after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, historians and investigators have attempted to account for this wealth. But the records are incomplete, many have been destroyed, and Soviet-era secrecy protocols remain difficult to penetrate. When Stalin died on the 5th of March 1953, his wealth didn't simply disappear. It remained in the Soviet system, controlled by his successors. Nikita Khrushchev, who emerged as Stalin's successor, inherited the system of hidden wealth that Stalin had built. But Khrushchev's relationship with this wealth was complicated. On one hand, he benefited from it using state resources for his personal comfort as Soviet leader. On the other hand, Khrushchev attempted some reforms, including a limited de-Stalinization campaign that involved acknowledging some of Stalin's crimes. But Khrushchev did not reveal the full extent of Stalin's personal wealth accumulation. The vaults remained locked. The artwork remained hidden or distributed among Soviet state institutions. The gold remained in Soviet reserves. The system of secrecy continued. This secrecy persisted through the Soviet period. Leonid Brezhnev, who followed Khrushchev, also benefited from and perpetuated the system of hidden wealth. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, the system had been operating for nearly 40 years after Stalin's death. The Soviet collapse in 1991 created chaos. Suddenly, there were partial disclosures. Some records were released, some officials fled with state assets, some wealth disappeared or was embezzled. But remarkably, some aspects of Stalin's hidden system remained even after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Today, more than 70 years after Stalin's death, many questions remain unanswered. Where did all the confiscated artwork go? Thousands of paintings and sculptures remain unaccounted for. Some are presumably in Russian state institutions, others may be in private collections, some may have been sold. How much Soviet gold is unaccounted for? Estimates of Soviet gold reserves vary widely, and discrepancies suggest that some gold may have been moved, hidden, or lost. Did Stalin establish foreign accounts? If he did, have they ever been located and liquidated? Or do they remain somewhere, dormant and forgotten? What happened to the Trophy Brigade's records? Many documents cataloguing confiscated property were destroyed or remain classified in Russian archives. These mysteries have inspired decades of investigation by historians, economists, art historians, and intelligence agencies. Books have been written, academic papers have been published, documentaries have been made, but the full truth remains elusive. Joseph Stalin was a murderer on an unimaginable scale. Between 6 and 9 million people died under his rule through execution, starvation, and forced labor. This is the moral center of Stalin's legacy, the human suffering he inflicted. But there is another dimension to Stalin's story, his systematic accumulation of wealth on a scale that few leaders in history have achieved. He monetized conquest. He transformed an entire nation into a wealth extraction machine. He accumulated treasures that rivaled the holdings of emperors and kings, and then he hid it. Why? Perhaps because showing the full extent of his personal wealth contradicted the ideological claims of Soviet communism. Perhaps because he wanted to preserve wealth for emergencies. Perhaps because he was simply obsessed with accumulating and controlling resources in the way that dictators often are. The mystery of Stalin's wealth endures because the records are incomplete, because some information remains classified, and because some wealth was deliberately hidden and never fully accounted for. This is the story that historians continue to investigate, the mystery that remains